There is a church in Germany with 3 iron cages hanging off its tower. Not in a museum, not behind glass. High on a working church above a shopping street in the city of Munster, right now, today. Tourists photograph them every afternoon. Most never find out what they are. They're empty now. They were not always empty. 490 years ago, each cage held the body of a man tortured to death in the market below. A man who had spent 16 months trying to build heaven on earth inside these walls. The one in the middle called himself King of the New Jerusalem. Before that, he was a tailor. And at the end of his story is a question nobody in Munster has ever been able to answer. Why are the cages still up there? Start in 1517. A monk nails some complaints to a door, and the most powerful institution in Europe cracks open like an egg. That's the part everyone knows. Here's what matters. Luther didn't just break the church's authority, he broke its monopoly on reading. Hand scripture to a continent of furious, hungry, half-literate tradesmen, and a lot of them go straight to the last book, Revelation, the end of the world. In 1524, the peasants of Germany read it and rose. 100,000 died. Luther urged the princes to cut them down like mad dogs. The grievances outlived the war. They went underground and got stranger. What came up out of that ground was Anabaptism. The core idea sounds boringly technical. Baptism should be an adult's choice, not something done to a baby who can't consent. Add no oaths, no violence, no priests. Share everything. It's a commune with a Bible. And in 1529, the Holy Roman Empire made it a capital crime. The mandate is explicit. Every rebaptizer and rebaptized person shall be brought from natural life to death, with fire, sword, or the like. No church trial, no inquiry, just execution. And here's the detail that tells you everything. It was the one thing Catholics and Lutherans agreed on. They agreed on nothing else that century. So by 1534, every Anabaptist in Germany was already, legally, a dead man walking, which turns what's coming from madness into something colder. The arithmetic of people with nothing left to lose. Now meet the prophets. It starts with Melchior Hoffman, a furrier, a man who sold coats. He announced Christ would return in 1533 and that the New Jerusalem would be Strasbourg. He was so certain he let himself be arrested. He'd calculated that a short imprisonment was a scripted step in the countdown. It wasn't. He died in that cell 10 years later, which means that through everything I'm about to describe, Melchior Hoffman was alive in a Strasbourg dungeon, forgotten, while other men burned a city down in the name of his arithmetic. One of his converts picked the prophecy up and moved it. Jan Matthys, a baker from Haarlem, tall, long black beard. When 1533 passed and the world didn't end, Matthys did what failed prophets always do. He didn't shrink the claim. He inflated it. Hoffman had called himself Elijah. Matthys announced he was Enoch, the second witness of Revelation. And the New Jerusalem wasn't Strasbourg. It was Munster. Then he changed one verb and a city died. Hoffman preached, wait. Matthys preached, take up the sword. So how does a doomsday cult capture a walled city? Munster had already gone Protestant, and its most popular preacher was drifting further out every month. Matthys sent 2 apostles in January 1534 and started baptizing. Over 1,000 adults, fast. Then he sent word across the Low Countries. Come to the New Jerusalem. Dutch believers poured in through the gates while the nervous Lutheran burghers packed up and left. In February, contemporary accounts say 3 suns appeared over the city. 3. It's a real thing. Ice crystals in freezing air, splitting light into mock suns, either side of the real one. Perfectly ordinary. Perfectly terrifying if you've been told for a year that God is about to speak. The pacifists picked up weapons. The standoff ended without the massacre they expected, and they read that as the Red Sea parting for them. And then, on the 23rd of February, 1534, Munster held its annual city council election. Nobody thought to cancel it, and the Anabaptists won it outright, every seat. A cloth merchant named Knipperdolling became Lord Mayor. That's the coup. No storming, no betrayal, immigration and a ballot box. The apocalypse arrived through a municipal procedure. 4 days later, armed bands went house to house. Be rebaptized or get out. The accounts say they shouted, "Get out, you godless ones, and never come back, you enemies of the Father." It was late February in Westphalia. It was snowing. 2,000 people walked out into it. Then, every book except the Bible was carried to the cathedral square and burned. 2 things went into that fire: the books and the city's charters. The paperwork proving who owned what and who owed whom. That's not anti-intellectualism. That's a delete key. You cannot restore the old world if the receipts don't exist. And with every commentary gone, nobody had anything left to check the profit against. Then he abolished money, not as a slogan, as an administration. 7 deacons, chosen by God after 3 days of prayer, took control of all gold, silver, food, and clothing, and went house to house with an inventory, hunting hoarded goods. Citizens who wouldn't hand theirs over were locked in a church until they changed their minds. For a few weeks in the spring of 1534, it worked. Then a blacksmith named Hubert Ruscher said in public that this foreign prophet knew nothing about their city and was a liar. The chroniclers say Matthews had him dragged into the market square, summoned the population, announced that God was outraged, and killed him himself. Then the crowd sang a hymn and went home. That's the turn. Because outside the walls, an army had arrived. And inside the walls, God had started talking to Jan Matthys again. The man outside was Franz von Waldeck, a prince-bishop, a political ruler in a mitre, which is why the answer to a religious rebellion wasn't excommunication. It was mercenaries. They sat there for 16 months. Inside, at the start, about 10,000 people. 1,500 able to bear arms, holding off a coalition of German princes for over a year. Whatever these people were, they were not merely stupid. Which brings us to Easter Sunday, the 5th of April, 1534. The night before, the eyewitness account says Matthys threw a feast. Halfway through it, he went silent, threw up his hands, and said, "O dear Father, not as I will, but as thou wilt." That is not a paraphrase of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. That is Christ in Gethsemane, word for word. Then he kissed every man at that table, said, "God's peace be with you all," and left with his wife. The next morning, he rode out of the gate with a handful of men, the accounts say a dozen, or 20, or 30. The version you'll hear is that Matthys thought he was bulletproof. No evidence for that. The bulletproof story belongs to a different radical in a different rebellion, and it migrated. He believed God had told him to be Gideon. And the point of Gideon in Judges 7 is that God cuts the army down to 300 men on purpose, so nobody can credit the victory to human strength. The absurdly small band wasn't bad maths, it was the argument. They cut him off and killed every one of them, put his head on a pole, and raised it high enough for the people on the walls to see. Then the mercenaries shouted up that they should come out and fetch their leader. One historian's point I can't shake. A con man does not ride into an army. Whatever else Jan Matthys was, he wasn't lying. That's the part that should frighten you. So the prophet is dead on Easter Sunday, having promised the opposite. The prophecy is publicly, spectacularly falsified, and a 25-year-old steps forward and explains that this proves the prophecy was true. Jan Bockelson, John of Leyden, a tailor who had already failed at it, apprentice tailor, then a merchant who went bust, then an innkeeper, the illegitimate son of a Dutch village mayor, and, one source says, a Westphalian serf, which would make him the bastard son of a bondwoman, about to crown himself Westphalia's king. Matthys had baptized him personally and sent him to Munster personally. The apprentice didn't usurp the master. The master built him. And here's the thing that makes the story click. In the tavern, he ran back in Leyden. He wrote plays, produced plays, and acted in them. And the Mennonite Encyclopedia records, dryly, that as a performer he liked to play the part of King David. The historian Norman Cohn puts it best. In Munster, he was able to shape real life into a play, with himself as the hero and all Europe for an audience. His enemies wrote the theatricality down as proof he was insane. Read it again. It's proof he was good at his job. He stood in front of the crowd and said, "God let Matthees die, so that you would not worship Matthees above God. And in the same breath, God will raise up another prophet, greater than he was." He converted the disproof of the prophecy into proof of it and booked the vacancy for himself in a single sentence. What happened next? His enemies described like this. He ran naked through the streets in a frenzy, fell into a mute trance for 3 days, and rose on the 3rd day with a revelation. Flag that hard. No chronicler is named for it, and it fits the hostile template too neatly. Nakedness, madness, a man staging his own resurrection. What isn't in dispute is what came out the far side. The council was gone. 12 elders, styled the judges of the 12 tribes of Israel, ruled the New Jerusalem. And above the 12, him. Where does all this come from? 2 men. Herman von Kersenbrock, a Catholic schoolboy expelled from Munster before John ever took power, who wrote his account 30 years later in a book titled, I'm not paraphrasing, Narrative of the Anabaptist Madness. His own modern translator's verdict: he saw very little, and he isn't a very good historian. And Heinrich Grisbeck, a carpenter, the only man who wrote an eyewitness account from inside. Except he escaped, sold the bishop the secret way in, and wrote it up for that same bishop, going quiet about his own role. Every word written to a man who could hang him or pay him. So we're seeing the New Jerusalem through 2 men, one who wasn't allowed to stay, and one who opened the gate. But their own theologian wrote the regime's theology down inside those walls, and it survives. So the honest version isn't, we only have their enemies' word, we have their stories and the cult's own theology, and the gap between them is the story. Now, the summer of 1534, the decree where utopia turns, polygamy. Compulsory. Every woman of age had to be married. Men took multiple wives. John took many. The traditional number is 16. And hold that loosely. The figure reaches us, hedged and unsighted, and the chroniclers can't agree whether the queen counts inside it or on top of it. And the reason is not the one you're expecting. Best estimates? Historians call them guesstimates. Put the besieged city at 8,000 or 9,000. Roughly 2,000 adult men, roughly 5,000 marriageable women. The movement had always drawn women disproportionately. When the unbaptized were expelled, men could leave more easily. They had trades elsewhere. Wives, daughters, and servants stayed. The convents were dissolved, and only men were dying on the walls, so the imbalance worsened while they drafted the decree. Which means, and this is the ugly bit, the emergency was self-inflicted. They engineered the crisis they then legislated a solution to. And here's the detail that kills the sex cult version. Stone dead. There was a rule. A man could not take a second wife until his first wife was pregnant. Same for the third. That is not an orgy. That is a breeding program with paperwork. Now hold it next to the legal code. In King John's Munster, the death penalty applied to blasphemy, seditious speech, scolding your parents, adultery, lewd conduct, backbiting, spreading scandal, and complaining. A regime that beheads you for lewd conduct is not a sex cult. It's the least erotic place in Europe. Scholars now think many of those marriages were never consummated and worked as welfare. A household slot for a woman who had none. Don't let that sanitize it. It was compulsory. Women were forced. It triggered an armed revolt that summer by men who'd followed these prophets through everything else and drew the line here. It wasn't lust. It was colder. Conscription. With a theology bolted on. Nobody was having fun. The revolt was crushed. On the 31st of August, the besiegers threw everything at the walls, and Munster threw them back. Days later, a lame goldsmith named Dusenscheuer, a man the city had written off as the village idiot, until the idiot became a prophet, announced that God had chosen a king. So in September 1534, A failed tailor from Leiden was crowned king of righteousness over all, king of the new Zion. He put a throne in the marketplace and sat on it in judgment. Gold chain, sword, spurs, velvet, all taken from citizens who were about to start starving, and around his neck, the emblem of his kingdom. It survives in a model for a medal in the British Museum. A globe of the world pierced through with two swords, spiritual and temporal, over the entire planet. A tailor in a town of 8,000, claiming the world. And then he minted coins. And everyone gets this wrong. You'll read they carried his face. They didn't. They carry no image at all because his religion forbade images. Just scripture and one line, one king righteous above all, and no value mark, because money had been abolished inside the city. So the king of the world struck currency his own subjects couldn't spend, legible only to the men outside trying to kill him. Not an economy. A sermon in silver, aimed at his enemies. Meanwhile, his subjects were boiling shoe leather. By February 1535, the food was gone. They ate grass, moss, leaves, hides, vermin, and they scraped the white lime paint off the church walls, dissolved it in water, and handed it round as milk. The city ate its own churches. That one is remembered rather than documented, so hold it lightly. And the decrees kept coming. The hungrier the city got, the longer the list of things you could be executed for saying about being hungry. In June 1535, one of his wives said it anyway. Elisabeth said out loud that it could not be God's will that the people starve while the king and his court lived in gold. She gave him back the jewelry he'd given her, and she asked simply to be allowed to leave the city. He refused. She was arrested. On the 12th of June, she was beheaded in the market square. We don't follow her there. You'll hear that he did it himself, and that afterwards he and his remaining wives danced around the body, singing. Hold that very loosely. I can't trace the dance to any chronicler at all. It reaches us through a popular history written in 1999. Test it. Gresbeck, the only man inside who wrote anything down, had gone over the wall 20 days earlier. Kersenbrock had been thrown out of the city 15 months before. Nobody who wrote this down was in Munster on the 12th of June. What does survive is from John's own mouth at his interrogation, asked what his wife had done wrong. One word: disobedience. His enemies added the dance because they didn't think the truth was monstrous enough. It was. 12 days later, the wall opened, because on the night of the 23rd of May, 2 men had gone over it. Gresbeck, the carpenter, who'd never believed it, and a mercenary called Hans Eck, who had fought for the bishop, defected into the city, become the king's own bodyguard, and now defected back for a cut of the war booty. On the night of the 24th of June, Gresbeck swam the moat, hauled a footbridge onto the bastion, and about 50 mercenaries came across, killed the sentries, and opened the gate. 300 men were inside before the Anabaptists could close it. Between 600 and 800 defenders died in the streets that night. Queen Divara, the brewer's daughter, who married Jan Mathies, watched him ride out of that gate, then married his successor and was crowned in gold, was beheaded on the cathedral square 2 weeks later, aged 23. And a receipt survives showing Hans Eck collected his money in December 1536. He died within weeks of being paid. They kept the king alive for 6 months. On the 22nd of January, 1536, John of Leyden and 2 lieutenants were brought onto a scaffold in front of the town hall, on the market street where his throne had stood. Each man was fixed to a stake by an iron collar. Then, for the space of an hour each, they were torn with red-hot tongs and revived every time they passed out. I'm not going to describe it further. 2 details do all the work. Nipperdalling, the Lord Mayor, the man who won the election, was made to watch the king go first, then tried to strangle himself on his own collar to cheat his turn. The executioner retied him so he couldn't, and made him take his full hour, and then the king. A Lutheran preacher named Corvinus stood in that crowd. The man who'd spent months in the cell trying to break him and wrote afterwards that John never made a sound. Not once. Not in the whole hour. Corvinus was disturbed. The people around him were not. They said it was a most pleasant thing to watch. So the silence in that square belonged to one person, and it wasn't the crowd. And one more thing. Among King John's reforms was the abolition of torture before an execution. He'd thought it barbaric. Then a blacksmith hoisted the 3 bodies, in 3 iron cages he'd forged for the purpose, up the tower of St. Lambert's Church, and they never came down. The bones rotted in place about 50 years. You could still see them up there around 1585, which means a child in Munster could grow old underneath them. The bones went. The cages stayed. When the old tower was demolished in the 1880s and rebuilt, the city wanted to hang copies and retire the originals, and the government forbade it. So the cages up there today are the real ones from 1536. In November 1944, an RAF bomb knocked one into a crater, one into the organ loft, and left the third swinging from the spire. And in 1948, in a city that was rubble, with everything else on earth to rebuild, Munster dug them out and put them back. Since 1987, a faint light has burned inside each one all night, every night. An artwork called Earlichter, Will-o'-the-Wisps, the ghost lights that lure travelers into the marsh to drown. As recently as 2017, the city was still arguing about whether to take them down. It can't decide. It never has. And there's one more twist nobody tells, right? You'll hear these people became the Amish. They didn't. The other branch, the Swiss one, had written nonviolence into its confession in 1527, 7 years before Munster's gates ever closed. The pacifism came first. What Munster did was prove them right at unbearable cost. A Dutch priest named Menno Simons lost his own brother to a Munster-inspired uprising in April 1535. He watched what this movement had become and renounced his priesthood on the 12th of January 1536, 10 days before John of Leyden died in that square. 10 days. One movement ending in a cage, its refutation born in hiding. Menno gathered the survivors and swore off the sword so absolutely that his name became a byword for people who will not fight, the Mennonites, and from them, later, the Amish. The most famous pacifists on earth are the cousins of the doomsday kingdom of Munster, not its children. Its answer. So, 3 iron cages, high on a working church, above a shopping street. A tourist stops and lifts a phone and looks up. And the honest answer to why they're still there is that Munster has spent 490 years unable to agree on what taking them down would mean. If you'd like more stories like this one, subscribing genuinely helps. And I'd like to know what you think, because the city still can't work it out. Should the cages come down, or does taking them down mean pretending it never happened?